Hey there. Good afternoon, everybody. It is Real Estate Recess here for April 25th, 2024. I am your hostess with the mostest, Jennifer Schurter, and I'm curious, what are you having for lunch today? I haven't eaten lunch yet. I've just drank an unusually large amount of coffee, so I feel like I'm going to run a lap around the entire neighborhood several times. That happens when you have too much coffee. So here I am. Hopefully I don't talk too fast with all this coffee. Some days are just like that, you know what I mean? So got a packed agenda for you. With some interesting pieces of information. One of those pieces of information is coming from an article from Fortune magazine where they interviewed the CEO of Redfin. His name is Glenn Kelman. And he had some interesting things to say and want to break that down and talk about it because all this stuff is national in focus, but in some way, inevitably, it boils down to our local area here, whether you're in the North Willamette Valley, Clackamas County, or the Portland metro suburbs, or Portland in general, for that matter. A lot of this does in some way relate or trickle down to us here on a local level. So we're going to talk about that. Then I have some interesting information from Ivy Zellman. This was an article in Business Insider, and Ivy Zellman's a researcher and what's about housing, and she's actually her claim to fame, and amongst many other things, one of her many claims to fame is that she predicted the housing crash back when the housing crashes happened in the 2008 2009 during those years. So really interesting to see what she has to say and with these charts. I'm not going to cover all of them, but there's 10 in total. So we're going to break down a few that I thought were particularly interesting and want to make sure I break that down for you. And finally, we're going to talk about what's happening here in Clackamas County. We're talking about these national headlines relating to the real estate world. Well, what's actually happening here in Clackamas County, and could any of this relate here locally? We'll see if we can draw some parallels to that. But I want to know what you think. Leave me a comment. Say, hey, would love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. If you like what you see and if you think I'm adding value to your life, would love to have you be part of the conversation. So let's get into it, shall we? Let's start talking about this article featuring Mr. Glenn Kelman, the CEO of Redfin. So what I really think is interesting about this article is it's saying that the title is "The Economy Might Be Booming, but Housing is in a Recession." Housing is in a recession. So the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about we are in a recession, I immediately go back to those 2008, 2009 years. That's kind of the most notable, most memorable, hard time in my very formative 20-something years. And that is immediately where my head goes and what that was like back then during those years and how looking back, and I'm sure some of you feel the same way, we bought our first house in 2007, and it was pretty devastating to see what happened to our price, the home value of the property we owned at that time. During those particular years, it was really painful. It was a big struggle. Again, I don't know how we made it through, but we did. I call it the old Dave Ramsey diet, the beans and rice and beans and every version thereof. Somehow we made it that way. But anyway, I digress. So the economy might be booming, but housing is in a recession. So I'm going to consult my notes here because this is a pretty meaty article. So again, you can find this on Business Insider is where this article's from. So here's some points that they talked about in this article that I thought were particularly interesting and the reason I think they're particularly interesting is because a lot of conversations I have with people on the street, so to speak, at events, at open houses, at gatherings, anytime I'm out and about in the community, people talk a lot about, well, we've been waiting for the market to crash. We're waiting for things to happen because I think when if I put things together for myself and say, well, what is a recession? A recession means everything's going to fall apart. The housing market is going to fall apart. We're going to see prices absolutely drop down. And I know a lot of people are out there waiting for that to happen. So what's interesting is he talks about in this article that last year, 2023 being last year, which is crazy to believe, honestly. I feel like I've lived 10 lifetimes since 2019. So still in a time vortex. So last year in 2023, existing home sales fell to their lowest point in almost 30 years. That is pretty bananas when you think about what happened in 2021 through early 2022, how many transactions and how much volume actually happened during those years when interest rates were really low and people were getting into the market just over and over, just like crazy. So basically, in this article, they're saying that housing market froze and it's only just begun to thaw. Mortgage rates were the highest they've been in more than 20 years, and they've come down since. So in a sense, yes, when this article or when this interview happened, they perhaps have come down. We hit that heavy 8% mark back in October of last year, which was a pretty dynamic and bodacious change in interest rates. If we think about it, we went from historic lows in the COVID years, 2020 through early 2022, up to a 20-year high at 8%. That's a huge pendulum swing for a market. And so for anybody out there who is waiting to buy a house or was potentially in the market, having witnessed that swing, either they're kicking themselves for not having purchased in the early 2020s, and now they're really regretting it, knowing that it's 8%. And that's what it was in 2023. Anyway, so yes, we hit that high, but we're still kind of in bumpy territory with the interest rates. People, when they're shopping for properties, are very payment dependent. And as a real estate advisor, that's exactly what I would encourage people to do would be to see what your payment is going to be and work backwards. What can you afford to pay on a monthly basis and work from there rather than looking at the sale price of a house? So obviously, what they can afford every month is going to be very dependent on what rates are doing. So I forgot to make my tea this afternoon, so forgive me while I've got a frog in my throat as I'm talking. So the costs of buying a home have gone up, and it's, and in here they're saying that it's very anxiety inducing, and it sure is. A lot of people I talk to, they are very anxious about higher interest rates. They're very concerned about what their home value is going to be. There's still a lot of concern about property values coming down. So anyway, so there's that. There's all of this feeling of the uncertainty because of interest rates. And I think what's interesting, not to go too far ahead into what we're going to talk about next, but I think that this article is an excellent side-by-side to what we're going to see from Ivy Zellman and what Glenn Kelman is having to say here. So Glenn Kelman goes on to say that this feeling of high home prices, high interest rates, that the cost of buying a home has gone up and prices haven't come down. The Fed's trying to tame inflation, but yet housing seems to kind of be untamable in this equation with the Fed, with what they're trying to do with inflation. So Kelman goes on to say that this is an anxiety-inducing thing that's happening right now, with housing being a basic need. And these would-be buyers, the folks who wanted to buy last year, are tired of waiting. And there's a lot of reasons that could drive that. And he goes on to say millennials, for instance, who the millennial generation right now is in what I would consider to be, and what many consider to be, the prime home buying years. With the elder millennials like myself, being in their early 40s, you've got that group of folks who, because of student loans, because of that burden of the debt a lot of folks in the millennial generation have gained, or that have dealt with student loans, they've put off buying a house, they've put off starting a family, but now it's like, okay, we're getting to a point where we're tired of waiting for these things. So they can only wait so long, is what Kelman's saying. And I absolutely agree with this. And the rest of the economy is booming, and yet housing's kind of in this weird place. He's calling it a recession. This is where I'm not sure that I necessarily agree or see the recession side of this with what Kelman's talking about. Perhaps you disagree. Leave me a comment. Would love to know if you think that the housing market, you would consider it to be a recession. Because when I think about this, I think about a recession being something that we're going to have declines happening. I haven't seen a lot of declines. The only thing that has been recessed is transactions and sales volume and people actually moving forward with purchases. They're kind of at a standstill. So I guess you could call what happened in 2023 a recession. Maybe a very slight one, but in the way that most people would define a recession, I'm not really sure that that's what I would consider it to be, this very severe thing. So, and here's another reason. Usually when, what they're saying in here is when sales decline, prices will drop. And then as sales increase and maybe there's limited inventory, then you see that price increase again. But one thing we have not seen in our real estate market is sales slowed, interest rates went up. It's kind of like this perfect storm of idea. You would think that, well, then supply and demand economics means that we're going to see home prices go down. If we have a slowing of transactions, there's not as many buyers out there. But instead, we're really seeing kind of the opposite. We had very minimal growth over the last year, but prices really didn't come down to speak of, especially in our local area. So it's really interesting. So anyway, he goes on to say, it's not a fad to own a house, which I agree. I think owning a property, and I've talked about this several times before, is a key component of an individual's net worth. Yes, you buy a property. You may buy a property and it's the home that you're going to occupy. Maybe it's the home you're going to live in with your family, whatever the case is, but you're going to have it and you're going to own it. And inevitably, you're going to gain equity on that property. And it becomes a function of your net worth because that equity, it's not exactly cash available as it stands, in a very basic way. But let's say 30 years down the road, when you retire and you want to downsize, you have this locked in nest egg in your property that can be used for a great many things for your future. So I think it's important. Home ownership is still very important. And so people still want that. And so anyway, I thought this was a really interesting article. I want to know what you think. Leave me a comment. Do you think that would you consider where the real estate market is to be a recession? Or do you think it was a temporary blip in the market and that we're going to continue to see price growth and inventory shortages? I know what my opinion is on that, but I'd love to hear what you have to say. So our next article here, which I think is quite interesting, is this article from the Glenn Kelman article was from Fortune magazine. This Ivy Zellman graphs, this one is from Business Insider. And so what Ivy Zellman is talking about here is, these charts, these 10 charts in this article are showing what's next for housing. And as I mentioned, Ivy Zellman is head of a research firm. And she's a former Wall Street analyst. Her claim to fame, once again, is that she predicted the housing bubble that was coming in 2008 and 2009. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on all of these graphs, but we'll come to this first one here. Home prices are growing despite high mortgage rates. So again, to go back to that Glenn Kelman article where they're talking about housing being in a recession, so this home prices are growing despite high mortgage rates. Ivy Zellman says that there's like a false start with these declining mortgage rates that home buyers really aren't pushing back. Home sales, despite higher interest rates and high prices, home buyers are starting to realize this as a possible new normal. There's all this talk about the Feds potentially lowering the basis points as they see inflation starting to cool off. Again, there's nothing is guaranteed. It's kind of like trying to predict nature. It's difficult to do. Like the weather people, the meteorologists have a hard time predicting exactly what's going to happen with the weather sometimes. I kind of feel like that is what's happening with inflation, with interest rates today. It's going to be difficult to predict. A lot of people were predicting much lower interest rates by the end of 2024 than what we're seeing right now. Some people have even alluded to the fact that we could see interest rates that start with a 5. Wouldn't that be fantastic? I think that would be fantastic, but I don't want to instill any false hope in anyone because there's still so many things at play. We just don't know what's going to happen. So with that being the case, if we've done our job as an industry and educating people about what's going on, we're not leading people to anticipate something that may or may not happen and to accept that if you're going to buy a property, Um, Perhaps this is the time to do it if you can afford it. The time is now. There's never a better. It's always you buy in the market you're in, right? So this graph here, home prices are growing despite high mortgage rates. So existing home prices have steadily appreciated from the depths of the financial crisis. That's going back to the crash years, 2008, 2009. And and that's really because of those lower mortgage rates that we experienced for that decade leading up to really the last year. When interest rates started to go up, I guess that's more than a decade. If we count the 2010s after the recession, after the crash, and as we started to come out of those years, those mortgage rates remained relatively low and stable for a good part of the 2010s and into the early 2020s. So, um, Ivy Zellman's firm, according to this graph, is saying that she's calling for much more modest price growth for existing homes, which I absolutely agree with. I think that that is something that we can easily anticipate. Um, and then an outright drop in property prices is highly and completely unlikely. So our next graph here is the historically low home supply has kept prices afloat. So what this one's saying is that elevated borrowing costs haven't put much downward pressure on home prices because of the persistent home shortage in the United States. So this issue likely stems, it says, from the trickle-down effects of home builders getting gun-shy after the housing bubble burst. We are in a low supply situation across the board. And depending on who you ask, I've heard figures from folks like the National Association of Realtors and so on saying that, yeah, we've got up to 4 million, 5 million, 6 million too few homes. So we need another 4 to 6 million homes to really fill the gap in need that we have across the country.